We're joined today by Wes Leckrone, professor of political science at Widener University. What stood out to you the most in Governor Shapiro's third budget address?
We always know that he's a pretty good messenger and knows how to communicate what he's talking about, which is obviously why he's rising in national prominence. But I thought this was a really kind of speech that took into account the political situation that he finds himself in right now. And that is one in which, we're having a long-term budget shortfall. And he's got a Republican state Senate, so really, has to negotiate with people. And I thought it was pretty much down the middle of the line and solidified the fact that he is kind of a moderate Democrat. And he gave us a really cohesive message today, and that was that, we've done some things before in the 2+ years that I've been governor. Let's keep moving forward and continue to do things that make sense for the Pennsylvania people, and just make some common sense things happen. And I thought it was a pretty good message. I think it would be hard to top. I mean, there were times when you might have listened to him and thought that he was a moderate Republican. The gloves didn't come off except for a couple of quips that he had. But I thought it was overall about as, bipartisan or nonpartisan as a governor could give in the situation that he finds himself in.
As you mentioned, the governor is said to have political aspirations nationally. He's going to be up for re-election next year. Do you think that played a role in what he proposed as well as how he proposed it?
Yeah, definitely. He's positioning himself kind of as a red state, even though we're not really a red state, but since Donald Trump's won twice here, that as a red state governor who's able to get things done, even though he's a Democrat. He speaks to moderation, and a number of the things that he said as you went through here could have been, have been traditional things that governors of both parties have said. But we see a lot of people out there running for president in 2028 right now that are just going directly after Trump. And what he did was he stayed on message. We're here to do what the people of Pennsylvania want us to do. And that is just to make common sense reforms in the state. And here's how we're going to accomplish this. And we're going to work together and do this and forget about the nasty political environment down in Washington. So I thought there were a lot of things throughout the course of his speech. He did not at all really touch on any culture wars issues. There was nothing about abortion. There was, at the end, kind of a little bit of a discussion about Pennsylvania's welcoming to everyone, but nothing about immigration. So I think, this was very much a speech that had, really no new taxes or broad-based taxes. Didn't break into the rainy day fund. So he can describe himself as, a fiscal conservative or moderate. So I think, there was a lot of the possibility of running as a centrist, both next year in the gubernatorial election, but also looking ahead to 2028.
During PCN's live wraparound coverage of the budget address, one of our guests, David Latour, had noted that what stood out to him was that the governor didn't talk about some of the things that were written in his budget materials, such as the closing of 2 prisons or potentially utilizing $1.6 billion of the rainy day fund. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I think that's part of the overall messaging. Let's not talk about anything that's necessarily negative. Let's keep this on to the principles of we're pushing the state forward. He kept talking about Pennsylvania's on the rise. And if that's what your messaging is going to be, then you're not going to necessarily talk about some of the negative things that might be written deep in the budget elsewhere. It's the core principle of we're doing stuff for you and it's in your best interest because that's what you elected us to do. And I think it's just, part of the core message is to stay positive as you go through there.
Last week, the governor unveiled his lightning plan for energy in Pennsylvania. What should our viewers know about that?
Well, for one, I was a little bit taken back about the limited amount of time that he spent talking about that today. And, I think usually maybe he thought that last week a press conference was enough, but generally you try to reiterate the same thing over and over again. And the more a politician can get their ideas out there, the better off they are. So, he kind of gave us some bullet points on that, but I was surprised that he didn't get into that in more detail today. But the general overall kind of notion behind this is that It's an attempt to be able to get more energy capacity here in the state of Pennsylvania by providing tax incentives to businesses that are willing to come online and open new facilities here in Pennsylvania. At the same time, it's also an attempt to be able to get, alternative sources of energy into our portfolio here in Pennsylvania. And, some of the innovative stuff is just to find out ways in which, for example, farmers might be able to capture methane and use that as the ability to be able to power local communities. So a lot of innovation, and probably deep in that is the more controversial plan to be able to cap carbon emissions in Pennsylvania, which we are no longer part of the regional greenhouse gas initiative because of the Commonwealth Court decision. And this is more or less what that would have been, which is a cap and then buying, allowances for that. There was not a lot of time spent on that other than, say, addressing climate change, because that's really kind of a lightning rod. The other stuff, investment in businesses, that kind of has broad support. But once you get into capping carbon, a lot of business interests are not interested in that. So I think that's partially one of the reasons why he might not have spent as much time on this as a lot of people expected that they would.
As you mentioned, the governor's carbon cap plan, I believe it was referred to as PACER last year, was not received in a positive light by Republicans in the House or Senate. Has anything changed to make him think that that might be more likely to pass this year?
No, but I think he's got a comprehensive kind of energy plan, and he has kind of 6 bullet points as part of this idea going forward for energy and the lightning plan. So I think that might be something that's on the negotiating table, so that maybe he's willing to drop that in order to be able to get some votes on the other side of the aisle in the Senate particularly. So he threw a lot of stuff at the wall in this plan, and try to get as much of it passed as possible. That may not be one of the things that passes, though.
The governor's plan includes incentives for the development of hydrogen, nuclear, and renewable energy. Where does natural gas fit into the equation?
Well, that's really what we produce in Pennsylvania. So, it's a tough call, right? I mean, nobody can say that they want to ban fracking or eliminate fracking in Pennsylvania. That's going to get elected statewide. We have to be honest about that, right? Because we export a lot of this. So I think the idea is that he's got to appeal to two distinguished constituencies. One is his own Democratic Party, who's pushing forward with a plan nationally that attempts to be able to get rid of all types of fossil fuels, of which natural gas is one of those. But at the same time, Republicans are also in tune with the fact that we've got a lot of this, and energy security is an important thing. So again, I think you can discuss these things without getting into the lightning rod issue of natural gas, particularly with the amount of jobs that it provides to Pennsylvanians.
Governor Shapiro had proposed accelerating the reduction of the corporate net income tax, but he is pairing that proposal with getting rid of the Delaware loophole. What do you think the impact is of pairing these two issues together?
Well, I mean, it's interesting when he was talking about the Delaware loophole, essentially, corporations getting around paying taxes by incorporating in Delaware. I thought it was really interesting that he mentioned that, if I remember correctly, it was 28, maybe 28 states, it could have been less than that, have addressed this issue. And he continued to mention that these were both red and blue states. In other words, this is basically it's a nonpartisan issue. People are using our resources, companies in Pennsylvania are using our resources without paying into the system, and this is just justice. And that's not a partisan issue, right? So, I think if you try to link the two, it also gives you some money to be able to pay for the corporate net income tax, cuts over time. And the fact that he's calling to accelerate that also kind of shows that he's a different kind of Democrat, a more moderate Democrat. And I also found it quite interesting that as he was talking about that, he immediately pivoted right after that by saying, I'm a Democratic governor that wants to cut taxes so that we can put money in people's pockets, but I want a higher minimum wage so people have more money in their pockets as well. I thought, he paired little things like that on and on throughout the speech, which I thought was a very effective mechanism.
Can the state afford to accelerate the reduction of the corporate net income tax at a time when we're facing a structural deficit?
Yeah, I mean that's a difficult situation that we find ourselves in, but I think he also there's we've been trying to lower this for years in Pennsylvania, and it's just never really found all that much traction. I think one of the things that he wants to have on his record as he runs for re-election as governor here in Pennsylvania, and also potentially running for president in 2028, is that he's a moderate on taxes, and he can have a record of saying that he cut some taxes to make Pennsylvania more competitive, and that's part of his economic record, which nobody's against jobs, right?
Since you mentioned the minimum wage just a moment ago, the governor did also once again call to bring the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. I believe this is the 7th year in a row that a Democratic governor has attempted to do so. Has anything in the legislative environment changed that makes this maybe more willing to pass this year than in prior years?
I don't necessarily see anything. I mean, the one thing that proves somewhat compelling is that most of the states around us, including, as he joked, West Virginia of all places, have increased their minimum wages, and some of them are at $15 an hour, which is what he wants. So there is some kind of compelling narrative that he could tie in there about this being, a workforce development issue, that we're losing people. But, for Republicans who generally still side with, businesses and small businesses, the equation hasn't really changed.
Many jobs that have traditionally paid minimum wage, such as fast food, for example, now pay several dollars above what that minimum wage is. Does that change the likelihood of this bill taking priority in the legislature?
No, because Republicans will argue that that's, in essence, the market working without the need for government regulation of the minimum wage. So they make the argument that, supply and demand, in order to attract workers, you're going to need to have higher pay scales, so we don't need the government involved in that. And that's pretty much not just here in Pennsylvania. That's kind of a national Republican talking point.
On the issue of mass transit, the governor is also proposing shifting a portion of the sales tax to further dedicate it toward transit funding. Will that be a tough sell for lawmakers that represent rural counties that don't necessarily have as significant of a mass transit system?
Well, yes, it always is, right? And I think mass transit is basically considered to be Pittsburgh and Philadelphia for the most part, although, a lot of smaller cities have pretty good busing systems and so forth. But I think what he tried to do in his budget speech today is really kind of combined roads, bridges, mass transit, and say that this is not an either-or situation. I think he used the word, it's an and situation. And that in order to be able to keep us competitive, in order to be able to allow families to, get home from their jobs, very personalized here when he was discussing bridges and, being able to avoid long commutes, and, personalize it into what this all means for people's daily lives. So it's kind of more of a grand bargain, I think, than it would be otherwise. And, he's pretty politically savvy that he kind of tied all three of those things together.
On the topic of school funding last year received over $1 billion increased funding. Can the state afford to continue to increase at such a rate for school funding?
Well, it's hard to quite understand where that money would come from, especially, the structural budget deficit that the independent fiscal office has said that we'll have, by 2030 of something like $6.7 billion. So it's hard to understand where revenue would come from, recurring revenue. We could draw down the rainy day fund, but this is a long-term project that, to be able to equalize funding to poorer districts around the state. There are two things that are on the table. We could potentially use, if we legalize recreational cannabis, could use some of that money dedicated toward education. The skill games he seemed to have set aside for older people, and also the general fund. So, maybe one of those two things, but without raising taxes, it's hard to quite understand where we'll get the money for that.
Recreational marijuana has been a bill that's been proposed by both Republicans and Democrats in both chambers. What have been the big sticking points on this issue?
I think a lot of it's kind of cultural conservatism in the state, right? I think with medicinal marijuana, it was a long time coming, and what really got, kind of Republicans on board with that was a lot of parents talking about epilepsy with their kids and the need to be able to use, nothing else works. Medicinal marijuana is the way to go. And I would have said that I would never have thought we'd have medicinal marijuana in Pennsylvania. But, I think there is a compelling argument that Governor Shapiro makes that may fly, and that is we're losing out on a lot of revenue because Ohio and New York and Maryland and New Jersey all have recreational marijuana. There's no doubt about it, as he mentioned, that people were going across the border to be able to get it. And if every corner of the state you live near a border, you can go to the next state and get it. We're losing out on this revenue. And if that could mean $1 billion or more a year, in the long term, that's a great way to be able to address at least, part of the structural budget deficit or be able to address the issue of education equity.
Do you think that sentiment in the legislature on specifically recreational marijuana is changing maybe over the last decade?
Yeah, I think as more states have adopted this, it's really been kind of a triumph of federalism, and in that what we see is that various states adopt the policy, you wait and see how it works there, and then you structure your regulatory system and how you go about selling it and what you're going to do based on what other states' experiences are. And I think, we might have a more restricted regime here in Pennsylvania than other states do. Those are all things that come out in the details. When we first got medicinal marijuana, it was very limited, and now pretty much it followed the model that California does. Pretty much anybody who can get a doctor to say yes, you can get it, right? So my guess is that we probably end up somewhere in the near future, whether it's this year or the coming years, with a pretty tight regulatory scheme, but that kind of eases up over time as well.
You also brought up the proposal of regulating and taxing skills games. Can you just briefly give us a thumbnail sketch? What is the difference between skills games and the games that someone would see at a Pennsylvania casino right now? And why is this not taxed or regulated at this time?
Right. So there's a difference between a game of chance and a skill game. And say, for example, you go and play a slot machine at a casino. That's all been pre-programmed to be able to allow a certain number of people to win, every, X number of pulls on the lever, although nobody pulls it anymore, you just push a button, right? But with the skill games, the people that make the argument that in every instance that somebody puts a coin in there or whatever they're playing with, every chance that you take, that you have the ability to be able to win on that. And that makes it different and unregulated here in Pennsylvania. But it is a source of revenue for a lot of small businesses. There's a lot of interests out there that are interested in not regulating this. So I'm really interested to see how this plays out.
How has Pennsylvania done from an economic standpoint in terms of recovering from the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, 2021?
Well, I think we bounced back very quickly, right? As did most states. And I think there was a number of reasons why. One was an enormous amount of influx of federal funding really helped keep the states afloat. Perhaps funding that they really didn't need because revenues bounced back pretty quickly. There are a lot of dire kind of predictions of what was going to happen post-COVID. Would it be like the Great Recession where it took years for states to be able to, get back to their high point in revenues? But most states, including Pennsylvania, fared pretty well coming back from that. That doesn't mean every place has. There's discussion today about helping out Pittsburgh because of it's kind of hollowed out downtown, particularly post-COVID. There are issues to be addressed. And it affected mass transit as well. Not with more people working remotely, particularly in a big system like SEPTA in Philadelphia area. Less people are riding, taking the trains into the city and using mass transit. But overall, certainly much better than we might have predicted back in, the dark areas of 2020.
Do you think the governor proposed anything that will be seen as being particularly innovative?
I thought what he did here, well, there are a couple of things that are innovative, but what he did here was throughout the course of this speech talk about small things that Pennsylvania government could do to help its citizens more effectively live their lives. And there's a lot of stuff in there that was 10 million, 40 million, not, 1.5 billion for something new. A lot of small programs that would help people out. And I thought that was very interesting because it speaks to how government can help people in their daily lives. Republicans may not view that as being a good thing or not, but it was a message that was directly to people saying we want to help you, we want to do stuff for you. I thought the life sciences issues that he hit on. And tapping into the resources that Pennsylvania has with our major research universities like Penn and Pitt and Penn State, and we've got other as well, a lot of research hospitals, particularly in Philadelphia, right? Tapping into those life sciences as a holistic way to build the economy. I thought that was pretty interesting because people don't oftentimes think of Pennsylvania as being innovative, but we have a lot of innovation here, and he can change the tone about what people think about Pennsylvania, and if we invest money in that, it can help other areas. I thought it was very interesting that he mentioned, that if we have biotech companies that I forget how many millions of eggs they bought last year from Pennsylvania farmers, but that's a way like, okay, I'm in a rural area. What do I have to do with this? Well, they use your products, right? And he gave that kind of holistic idea of what this would mean to people around the state and not just in certain areas. So I thought that was pretty innovative.
Did you see some of the governor's initiatives as being targeted toward perhaps one caucus over another or one political party over another, perhaps to create bargaining chips during negotiations?
Well, I mean, I think there were some things like as I mentioned a little bit earlier. I think the cap and trade program, not the cap, the cap on carbon emissions. He wants to do that because that is an important kind of plank of the Democratic platforms. But he might have thrown that out there just as a negotiating trip. That's certainly there. I was interested in the way from the very start that he talked about working together. And that fits into your question about negotiation because he said, look, he didn't quite say this literally, but he said it's kind of a mess down in D.C. But what happened was, around the country things changed, but it didn't change here. We came back. We've got a Democratic governor. We've got a Democratic House. We've got a Democratic Senate, and it's all in the same proportion as it was last time. People just want us to work together in Pennsylvania. And the way that he used we throughout this, we have accomplished this, and we will continue to do this. And, we stand up for Pennsylvania, I felt was the right ploy to be able to enter into negotiating tactics. Now, look, this is all fall apart in a day, right? But it was the right tone to take when you're dealing with a split legislature and a particularly partisan country right now. So I thought that his overall tone and the way he addressed this, attempted to be able to bring both sides together.
How would you characterize the governor's relationship with legislative leaders?
He's an avid politician, right? And he's a person that seems unlike some other governors that we've had in the recent past that is are more convinced that they're right and not really willing to negotiate quite as much. He seems to be more in tune with negotiating with people and trying to find a way. Again, because that's part of his political brand. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of hard feelings between Republicans and Democrats, particularly in the Senate caucus. There's still hard feelings about the school vouchers from a couple years ago. So, while it's a good position, like the political reality is we are still in a very divided country and a very divided state. So, the possibilities are good. Like if there's a person that can accomplish it, it's probably him. But there's a reality of what's actually happening too.
The governor's speech ran, I believe, 91 minutes in duration. What do you make about the length of the speech? And by comparison, Governor Wolf's speech ran roughly between 20 and 50 minutes.
Yeah, you know, I heard one of your earlier commentators say, and at minute 91, he pretty much looked as enthusiastic as he did at minute one, and I can certainly say that, yeah, that is true. You know, some people are more interested in just racing through and don't like the political theater that this is all about. Governor Shapiro is not one of those people. He's a person that is very crafty in the way that he comes up with a message and he enjoys talking. You know, I don't know how many people watch this. My guess is probably a minimal amount. It'll get some stuff on the nightly news. So, you know, people are going to pull out their clips of what went on here. And at the end of the day, it probably really doesn't matter how long it was.
Wes Leckrone, professor of political science at Widener University. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.